It's August 1971. A newspaper ad runs in Palo Alto, California. It asks for volunteers, $15 a day, a study of prison life. Around 75 young men answer. 24 are chosen, the most stable, the most ordinary. No criminal records, no history of violence, nothing at all to suggest cruelty. A coin decides the rest. Half become guards, half become prisoners. Nobody is forced. Nobody expects what comes next. 6 days later, the experiment is shut down early, and for almost 50 years, the world would believe the wrong story about why. The man behind it is Philip Zimbardo, a psychologist at Stanford University, young, ambitious, persuasive. He wants to answer one enormous question. What happens when you put good people in an evil place? Not bad people, not criminals, ordinary students. He believes the place itself, the roles, the walls, the power, can turn decent people into monsters. He wants to prove it. And he has funding from the U.S. Office of Naval Research to try. So he builds a prison. In the basement of Jordan Hall, the psychology building at Stanford, a corridor is converted into cells. Real bars, real locks. A tiny closet labeled The Hole for solitary confinement. Then he does something no one expects. He calls the Palo Alto police. On a Sunday morning, real officers drive to the homes of the young men assigned to be prisoners. They arrest them. Handcuffs, squad cars, neighbors watching from windows. The prisoners are blindfolded, booked, stripped, and dressed in smocks stamped with numbers. From that moment, they have no names. Only numbers. The guards get something else. Khaki uniforms, wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses so that no one can see their eyes. The plan is to run it for 2 weeks. At first, it's awkward. The guards feel silly. The prisoners laugh. It looks like a group of college kids playing dress-up in a basement. By the end of the first day, nothing is funny anymore. On the second morning, the prisoners rebel. They tear off their numbers. They barricade the cell doors. And the guards respond with a fury that seems to come from nowhere. They blast the prisoners with a fire extinguisher. They strip them. They drag the ringleaders into solitary. They invent punishments on the spot. One guard in particular stands out. His name is Dave Eshelman. The prisoners call him John Wayne for the swagger, the drawl, the cruelty he seems to reach for so easily. He pushes further every shift. Humiliation, exhaustion, endless push-ups on cold concrete. He becomes the living face of everything the experiment claims to reveal. And then a prisoner breaks. Prisoner 8612, a young man named Douglas Corpy. On the second night, he starts to scream. He says he can't take it. He says he has to get out. The staff watch him come apart, and later they describe it as a genuine psychological collapse. Question: if ordinary students can crack this fast, what does that say about the rest of us? The story spreads. It becomes one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology. It lands in textbooks, documentaries, lectures around the world. Zimbardo builds a career on it. The lesson is repeated for decades, clean and terrifying. Good people, dropped into a bad situation, will become cruel. The situation wins. Every time. It's a comforting kind of horror. It means the guards weren't evil. It means you, in their shoes, might have done the very same thing. The place did it, not the person. There's only one problem. That isn't what happened. Decades later, a French researcher named Thibault Le Texier went digging. Not into memory, into the archive. Stanford had kept the original recordings, the staff notes, the tapes from that basement. Le Texier sat down and listened to what was actually said. In 2018, he published his findings in a book whose title says almost everything. In English, An Investigation into the Stanford Prison Experiment. In the original French, he called it simply The History of a Lie. Around the same time, an American writer named Ben Blum tracked down the men who had been there. His account carried a title just as sharp, The Lifespan of a Lie. And what they found took the myth apart, piece by piece. Start with the guards. The story had always been that they turned cruel entirely on their own, that the situation did it with no push from above. The tapes told a different story. The guards were coached. The warden, a student named David Jaffe, told them plainly that they needed to be tough, that the prisoners had to feel powerless, that a passive, gentle guard was failing the experiment. On one recording, a reluctant guard is pressed to be harsher, because kindness wasn't giving the researchers the results they were hoping for. The cruelty wasn't purely spontaneous. It was, in part, an assignment. Now the most sadistic guard, Dave Eshelman. John Wayne. For decades he was Exhibit A, proof of how quickly a normal man becomes a monster. But Eshelman later said he was acting, consciously, deliberately. He built the character on a cruel prison boss he'd seen in a film, and he pushed the cruelty on purpose, because he believed that was the point. He thought he was helping the experiment succeed. He wasn't losing himself, he was performing a role he thought the scientists wanted. And Prisoner 8612, the breakdown that shocked everyone, Douglas Corpy. Years later, Corpy said his screaming had not been a collapse at all. He said he was acting too. He wanted to leave, realized he couldn't simply quit, and staged a meltdown to force his way out. In that moment, he said, he was never truly traumatized. The three pillars of the legend. The guards who turned on their own, the sadist who lost himself, the prisoner who broke. Each one cracks the moment you listen to the tape. So what really ran that basement? Not some dark force hiding inside ordinary people waiting for its chance, something quieter, and in a way more unsettling. People trying to give the authority in the room exactly what it wanted. Guards told they were serving science, students eager to get the experiment right, and a man in charge who was never a neutral observer at all. Because here is the detail that changes everything. Zimbardo didn't just watch. He ran the prison. He gave himself the title of superintendent and stepped inside his own study. There was no cool scientist behind the glass, measuring from a safe distance. The man recording the pressure was also the man applying it. And the ending everyone forgets? It didn't stop because the science was finished. It stopped because of one person who walked in from the outside. A young psychologist named Christina Maslach. She came to observe, saw what was being done to the prisoners, and was horrified. She told Zimbardo it was wrong. She refused to treat it as normal. And her objection is what finally ended it, after just 6 days. One outsider. One person who wouldn't go along. That is what broke the spell. So the famous lesson was almost exactly backwards. The experiment didn't prove that anyone becomes a monster in the right room. It revealed something about instruction and expectation, and how far people will go when a credible authority tells them it's for a good cause. And how much can hide inside a story simply because that story is more thrilling to believe. The horror was never that a situation turns good people evil all on its own. The horror is how willing we are to play the part we're handed, how readily we perform cruelty when someone we trust tells us it matters, and how long a comforting lie can survive once it's wearing the costume of science. So think back to that ad. $15 a day, a study of prison life, 24 ordinary young men sorted by the toss of a coin. You've always been told this story proves what a place can do to a person. But watch yourself the next time someone with authority hands you a role and calls it important. Watch how naturally your hand reaches for the uniform. Watch how quickly, "I was only doing what they wanted," begins to sound like the truth. The lie of the Stanford Prison Experiment was never really about a basement in 1971. It was about how badly every one of us wants to believe we'd have been the one to say no.